Hello and welcome to the WERA International Research Network on Human Rights Education, to this symposium by network members. Next slide. The purpose of this symposium is to introduce our WERA IRN on human rights education to the wider education research community. And what we will be doing is presenting a range of perspectives on human rights education research, drawing on various disciplinary traditions and researchers from different geographical locations. And all these presenters have worked together before. They are Marta STACHURSKA-KOUNTA from Oslo, Norway, Rebecca ADAMI from Stockholm University in Sweden, Yuka KITAYAMA and Yoriko HASHIZAKI from Osaka University and Nara University of Education, Hugh STARKEY, who's one of the conveners of the network, and myself from the University of Southeastern Norway. And what do we have in common? Well, members of this network have been working together since 2019 as a network. It's a global range of research activities. We're all linked to the open access journal Human Rights Review. It's a peer-reviewed scholarly journal, and people have various roles: reviewers, board members, and some of the editors are also here. Our network runs a webinar series, which has been running throughout this year and will be recommencing. And you should be able to see in front of you our YouTube channel. So those people who aren't able to see the sessions live can go to that address and look at our seminars. And we also have a Twitter account where you can follow us. Thank you, and I will be handing over now to our first presenter, who is Marta STACHURSKA-KOUNTA. Thank you.
Marta, can I hear you?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to hold this presentation. The title of my presentation is Early 20th Century Antecedents to Human Rights Education. When I was asked if I could prepare this presentation, I was not really sure what ideas I could refer to, since human rights education, both as a universal demand and as a field of study, is usually traced back to the proclamation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1940. And until then, neither the idea of universal human rights itself was fully developed. But when you look at the definition of human rights education provided, for example, by the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training, you can see that human rights education refers also to education, I quote, aimed at empowering learners so that they can both enjoy and practice their rights and respect and uphold the rights of others. So I decided to focus on two aspects: empowerment and respect for the rights of others. And in this way, I arrived at two issues which I will argue may be seen as antecedents to human rights education. The first one is child welfare and right to education. Education as a fundamental human right is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in addition, right to education is also a human right which is indispensable for the exercise of other human rights. So in this way, it is possible to argue that furthering access to education for the working class in the 19th century and in the early 20th century may be seen as a significant work preceding recognition of education as a human right. This work may be seen as contributing to empower members of the working class and fostering more egalitarian societies. The second issue I have decided to analyze concerns international and transnational efforts, especially in the interwar period, to promote less nationalistic education. These efforts may be seen as antecedents to human rights education because they were aimed at empowering learners to respect and uphold the rights of others. In addition, it is also possible to argue that these efforts correspond to the call for education promoting, I quote.
Hi, Marta, can I just stop you there? Because I'm not seeing your
Yes.
slides going forward. So I'm going to ask you to...
She's looking at her own.
Yeah.
Yes. I
try and
don't
go-
know what...
Yeah, try and go full screen. Set your
It is full screen. I know what you mean. It is
Yeah.
full screen. I know.
Okay,
I'm
so
sorry.
it's like frozen.
On her side, so she needs to stop share and reshare.
So I think stop share and reshare. Let's see if we can sort it out quickly.
Okay, I will do
Go
it.
stop share, and
Yes.
then reshare.
Oh.
Oh, don't worry.
Screen.
I'd rather have it right
Yes,
than you just talking to
Yes, of
the
course,
screen.
but well,
Okay, there.
but can you
Right.
see?
I can
this
see
way?
now. I'm going
Maybe I
to try and share it all again with everybody. What I need to do there.
Because I know what you mean, and usually it works. But if you cannot see the full screen,
No,
then
exactly. No, it's fine. Not to worry. All right, stand by. I'm going to take you.
Oh.
All right, go full screen again.
Or just tell her to see if she can move it like that. Maybe.
Or just see if you can move. Just go to another slide.
Can you see? I'm moving forward.
You move. You're going to other slides.
No, she's in the wrong. She's sharing. She's in the wrong. She's sharing a full screen.
Okay, so you're sharing a full screen, and you should be sharing.
Just tell her to see if she can look for the operation.
I am sharing the full screen now.
Yeah.
Can she see the full screen?
And are you seeing the full screen? You're seeing the full screen.
Okay, so tell her to stop sharing.
Stop sharing again.
Yes.
When she shares now.
And when you share, it's going to give you options.
Just look for don't share her. She mustn't share her working PowerPoint. She must share a full screen option. In the window, there should be two pictures. She needs to share the full screen picture.
So when you share it, it will give you two options. It will give you full screen or window. You must select full screen.
In the window, she must look for the full screen PowerPoint.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Have you found it? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. Okay. Just move it. All right. Okay. Stand by, everybody.
Okay.
Let me just reselect everybody.
Yes.
Okay. Give me a second. All right. Let's see if that works. Move a slide.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. All right. You can start wherever you want to. Sorry about that, everybody, but we sorted it out.
Anyway. Okay. So I will just I'm presenting now these two issues which I consider to be antecedents to human rights education. And I have started to talk about the first issue, which is child welfare and right to education. And now I just want to continue with the second issue concerning international and transnational efforts to promote less nationalistic education. So I will now move to elaborate on these two issues, and I will start with child welfare and right to education. With regards to this issue, it is possible to refer to two more or less parallel processes. First, the legislation which gradually restricted and prohibited child labor. The Industrial Revolution led to a dramatic increase in number of children at work, and this in turn hindered them from attending school. By the end of the 19th century, most of the states across Europe and the United States adopted laws restricting child labor. Still, the minimum working age could vary as well as to what extent the laws were observed. The second process concerned introducing compulsory education. This process significantly accelerated during the second half of the 19th century, continued in the early 20th century. Introducing compulsory education was in fact also the best means of enforcing prohibition of child labor, because parents would have to send children to school instead of sending them to work. Anyway, until the end of the First World War, these efforts, both to prohibit child labor and introduce compulsory education, concentrated on advancing changes on a national basis. It was establishment of the League of Nations in 1919 that provided a first permanent international forum where states, associations, and other actors could submit their proposals and advocate for international regulations. So in 1924, the General Assembly of the League of Nations adopted the Geneva Declaration of the Rights of the Child. It was indeed a historic document because for the first time, the signatory states affirmed the existence of rights specific to children and recognized the responsibility of adults towards children. The fundamental needs of children were summarized in 5 points, and the document recognized the rights to development, assistance, relief, and protection. And although the Declaration of Geneva did not mention explicitly the right to education, it proclaimed, among others, that, I quote, "the child must be given the means requisite for its normal development, both materially and spiritually." There are, however, certain aspects which may be used as counter-arguments against referring to these developments in terms of antecedents to human rights education. First of all, the legislation securing right to elementary education, though certainly contributing to empower the working class, was not necessarily designed to dismantle the traditional class distinction. The reforms produce often divided systems of education. And this happened, for example, in Great Britain, where the reforms led to a system based on 2 tracks, one for the privileged minority, trained for university entrance and then for the top jobs, and the second for the mass, which were denied anything but an elementary education. On the opposite side, it is possible to refer to the 1936 Soviet Constitution, which was the first constitution to recognize the rights to education with a corresponding obligation of the state to provide such education. By guaranteeing free and compulsory education at all levels, the Soviet Constitution was undoubtedly extremely progressive. However, having in mind school realities in Stalin's Russia, it is not possible to forget of the dark side of the Soviet school system, where other rights of both pupils and teachers were violated on the daily basis, like freedom of expression or freedom of association. It is also relevant to add in this context that in many other countries, introducing compulsory education was related to violating rights of children from ethnic minorities and indigenous groups, as these children were usually forced to abandon their own language and culture and assimilate. Finally, as I have already mentioned, while addressing certain fundamental rights, the Declaration of Geneva actually concentrated on adults' obligation to children. Therefore, it is plausible to argue that although the Declaration was an expression of a growing understanding of the need to strengthen child welfare, it failed to recognize children as full right holders. Moving to the second issue, which is international and transnational efforts to promote less nationalistic education in the early 20th century, it is again necessary to refer to the League of Nations. Originally, the drafters of the League's covenant did not include education as an object of jurisdiction for the new organization. However, they did assign the League special responsibilities for the protection of children and international intellectual cooperation. The League became indeed the center and main agent for the establishment of new educational networks which worked to promote international education, peace, and mutual understanding. In the interwar period, these efforts concentrated on two main areas. The first one was about revision of curriculum and school textbooks, and the idea behind the revision of the school books was to eliminate passages that were untrue or contain offensive expression concerning other countries. And this work was seen as a means for promoting cross-national understanding. These efforts were especially promoted in Europe and Asia, and there were agreements, for example, between China and Japan in this field. League of Nations was also active in promoting exchange programs for students and teachers. For example, in the late 1920s, there was an exchange program for students from United States, Britain, France, and Germany, and the League supported actively also exchange programs between the European countries and China. And to facilitate these efforts, the International Bureau of Education was established in 1999. It was a kind of information center for all matters relating to education. There was, however, significant resistance among the national governments to internationalize education. This resistance led to the generally accepted view that national education lies outside the competence of any official committee of the League. And as a result, national governments responded by including some of the recommendations, but ignored the League's broader plans. I wish to finish my presentation now, and I would like to stress that it is still work in progress, and I would appreciate any comments, any suggestions, especially suggestions on what other examples from the early 20th century may be considered as antecedents to human rights education, and especially if it's possible to provide examples which would go beyond the notion of human rights as an exclusively Western project. Thank you for your attention.
ADAMI from ST, and I will invite Rebecca to introduce the paper.
Good evening, everyone. I want to express my gratitude to Audrey and Hugh for making this session possible. Just making sure that my presentation works, right? That was the second slide. So my paper presentation addresses the gap in a human rights discourse that has been blind to the norm shaping by Southern women delegates to the United Nations. And the aim of my paper is to rectify the misconception that the universality of human rights rests on a Western imperialism, guided by the question of how Southern women in the history of the UN argued for the universality of human rights against colonial and patriarchal interests. And in my presentation today, I will, due to time constraints, not detail the different historical studies that underpin my argument. I refer all interested to the open access new volume that I will share with you all in the discussion chat after the presentation. So then you can study the different historical studies in the book on the key figures in the history of the UN who were part of drafting the core UN documents on human rights. The reason why universality of human rights has been discussed so much by human rights education scholars is because the validity of human rights is found in its universal applicability. Universality lends raison d'être to human rights education in contrast to citizenship education. The facets of dignity, equality, and non-discrimination become meaningful if learners in different contexts feel addressed and included as rights bearers in the historical and present-day narratives of human rights. As human rights education generally clashes with the nationalistic framework of citizenship education, additional motivation beyond identifying as citizen of a certain country is what calls for human rights education. When the dominant narrative of international human rights is one that frames gender equality as a Western feminist project, when there is a wide gap between the idea of non-discrimination and the lived experiences of marginalized groups, and when dignity seems tied to economic and social status at birth, then these human rights principles become identified as particularistic. The problem encountered in human rights education is thus how historical narratives of human rights address only Western subjects and how present-day narratives of human rights locate their urgency only in neighboring countries while ignoring violations at home. The dominant and particularistic historical and present-day narratives of human rights are a result of and continuation of epistemic injustice. There is an inherent tension in human rights education as a normative education on values and core concepts stemming from UN conventions when combined with the appreciation that academic knowledge is not neutral, but knowledge production is situated within dominant narratives, historical and ideological ones, that shape understandings and interpretations of facts and ideas. And Walter C. Parker suggests that we need to work toward greater epistemic strength of what learning human rights mean. History, reasons Parker, is a school subject that has succeeded in creating a disciplinary integrity of what is that is needed in human rights education as well. The first step to achieving such disciplinary integrity of human rights education, according to Parker, is to identify human rights education knowledge base, its disciplinary concepts, cases, history, literature, and skills. Merely reading articles in the UN conventions and declarations might, for students in human rights education, enhance a feeling of estrangement, as these are formulated as decontextualized principles. Delving into a more complex history of core human documents, however, defining human rights was and continues to be a contested international effort to conceptualize rights beyond limited notions of citizen rights. The universality of human rights was in the 1940s and 50s argued against the interest of colonial powers to exclude women and men living in non-self-governing territories. UN meeting protocols provide entrance into fascinating debates between representatives from colonial powers and newly independent countries formerly under colonial rule, who were involved in the process of defining the articles of the UN declarations and conventions today referred to as UN Framework International Human Rights Law. Disciplinary knowledge is an epistemological resource enabling students to think about the world in abstract or context-independent ways. But human rights education suffers from an epistemological problem of what Walter Parker refers to as knowledge blindness. And in my paper, I refer to such knowledge blindness in human rights education as a form of epistemic injustice. Due to hermeneutical injustice, which is knowledge gaps in the history of human rights owing to colonialism, racism, and patriarchy, certain students, but not others today, will feel addressed by human rights. And knowledge blindness, read as epistemic injustice, is caused by oppressive systems like colonialism. British educational policy will mention British values in connection to human rights education, while ignoring to problematize how human rights were suppressed in other countries under its history of colonial rule, and how political and economic rights might continue being marginalized through conditions of economic agreements with former colonies, current possessions of the UK, and through the British Commonwealth. In Sweden, human rights will permeate national curriculum in terms of creating understanding of its core values and peaceful relations with other nations, while ignoring to mention in its history subject the colonial practices of extracting natural resources from its indigenous population, segregating Sami children, and drawing up laws and regulations discriminatory in the history of the Sami people's political rights and their right to land as indigenous population. So human rights education in national curricula will thus become particularistic due to nationalistic dominant historical and present-day narratives. To work toward greater epistemic strength in human rights learning, as Parker suggests, means getting the history of the United Nations right by recognizing the role that women from the Global South had in developing the international framework of human rights. The knowledge blindness in human rights education is a result of the ways in which scholars and practitioners continue to overlook a more diverse women's history. A continuous neglect of this history constitutes hermeneutical injustice, and a decolonizing effort in human rights education thus need to recognize the critique leveled against colonial powers in the history of the UN by women from India, Pakistan, Ghana, Namibia, Nigeria. Those are some of the countries in the new volume that have resulted in the human rights framework that we know today. And when based on research that aims to rectify the epistemic injustice caused by colonial and racist discourses that disregards non-Western agency, human rights education can, I hope, reclaim itself as a cosmopolitan project not trapped in Western epistemic hierarchy. In Women and the UDHR from 2019, I will put these links up in the discussion chat, and Women and the UN from this year, but it says 2022. Scholars from different disciplines have revisited some of the crucial UN documents that shaped human rights into universal language of gender equality and non-discrimination. This history of international human rights demonstrates how human rights and gender equality were inscribed in the core documents of the UN, thanks to women delegates from the Global South. Lakshmi Menon, that you can see here, from India, was delegate in the UN General Assembly and advocated in 1947 for the importance of adopting a legally binding convention on human rights so that the UN could hold member states accountable for human rights violations. This became two covenants, as you know. It was split into two parts due to the Cold War. She stressed the need for human rights to apply to all human beings living in non-self-governing territories, in other words, under occupation or colonial rule. Through other trajectories of the history of international human rights at the UN, we recast the universality of human rights from a narrative of Western imperialism to a counter-narrative in which we owe its universality to agency from the global South. That Indian, you can see this one here, and Pakistani women freedom fighters were pivotal for advancing human rights as an inclusive concept of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with reference to women's rights in the private as well as people's right to revolt against oppression, will shed light on the struggles they had to take at the UN against other male and Western delegates. When the member states of the UN started the work to turn into international law, the human rights set forth in the UDHR, reference to local customs was a defensive claim against universal application of various human rights measures. And Roland Burke, in this new volume, states that these claims were encapsulated in a proposed colonial application clause, which allowed metropolitan power to exempt their colonies from treaties. The new historical studies into international human rights that credit women from the global South, ranging from Latin American feministas' role at the drafting of the UN Charter in 1945 to Namibia's initiators to the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000, rectifies the misconception that human rights would be anything connected to Western imperialism. Instead, the scholars in this volume assert the ways in which its universality was gained in opposition to Western powers. The role that women from Iraq, Indonesia, Egypt, Togo, Guinea, Nigeria, and the Philippines played in the 1950s to ensure that no colonial clause was inserted in the first binding human rights conventions on women's political and civil rights and the rights in connection to marriage, recast international feminism and gender equality in the history of the UN as a global Southern project. To conclude, in a similar sense as academic writing is a form of selecting, arranging, and presenting knowledge, so is the teaching of human rights education a selection, arrangement, and presentation of knowledge that can both lead to and be a continuation of epistemic injustice. The teacher's selection of historical and present-day narratives on human rights can either give legitimacy to universality if based on diverse origins and application at home, or human rights education can reify a Western particularistic narrative through nationalistic rejections of universality and imperialistic teachings that neglect the need for contextualization and problematization of dominant narratives. By reading Fricker's hermeneutic injustice as a kind of structural discrimination resulting from prejudicial exclusion from participation in the spread of knowledge, decolonizing methodologies can serve to rectify gaps in our hermeneutical horizons through human rights education. Thank you.
We have now two presentations looking at the importance of telling history and looking at the relevance of history to human rights education. Now we turn from Yuka Kitayama and Yoriko HASHIZAKI from Japan. We look forward to hearing your presentation, which I think brings us into the present. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to present about the ethic of care as a pedagogical approach to human rights education and examine a case study in Japan. So this is an outline of our presentation. First, we introduce different approaches to human rights education. focusing on legal and emotional dimensions. Second, we briefly outline the concept of ethics of care and examine it as a pedagogical approach to human rights education. Then, we examine a case study, a gender and sexuality education for teacher candidates. Finally, we draw some implications for human rights education practices. So, human rights education involves not only knowledge about human rights as a legal instrument, but also imagination and empathy, which help learners to have a sense of commitment and engagement to human rights issues and of others. Human rights legal instrument can be used as a universal and a common reference point for learners to identify human rights violations happening in different contexts. Human rights as a universal value can also be a core support for democracy and social justice, which can be applied not only to people in the same community, but also those in a distant place. However, such legal instrumental approaches stressing universality and rationality may lead to a stereotypical dichotomy, such as rational West and emotional East. Emotional aspects of human rights education promote learners to put themselves in others' shoes. Learning about someone's struggles from their perspectives may bring learners uncomfortable emotions. However, Baron and Dembius argue that such discomfort can also be a learning opportunity. Barton and Hall argue that emotional aspects of human rights education also have strengths in motivating learners to take an action than human rights education merely focuses on rational aspects. Nevertheless, there are some criticisms. For example, human rights education stressing on interpersonal and emotional aspects may focus too much on personal morality and fail to promote understandings about legal aspects of rights. The ethic of care focuses on vulnerability and interdependence as a nature of all individuals. It stresses interpersonal relationship because we are all born from and into relation. In a caring relationship, a carer listens to a cared for attentively and put aside own values and projects, and tries to understand and express needs of the cared for. It particularly pays attention to context and consequences of suffering people rather than judicial and moral judgment. These arguments are suggested as feminist critiques against liberal conceptions of justice, which take it for granted that individuals are independent and autonomous citizens. So ethics of care as a pedagogical approach can promote an intersectionality perspective by learning from face-to-face relationship, which is originally emphasized by scholars such as Noddings. It provides a learning from particular others' experiences and worldviews. However, learners may have limited opportunities to meet such people directly. It is also possible to promote intersectionality perspective by learning from narratives of others, which can be used as powerful media to share knowledge, experiences, promote change in accessible form. But it also has a pitfall, because it can be interpreted differently by different readers. The third point is making a caring learning environment. For example, promoting freedom of speech in safe learning environment for all would be crucial to discuss a sensitive topic. Such accumulation of experiences of caring and being cared would encourage one to care others, including a stranger. In Japan, schools, especially younger age group in primary and secondary schools, tend to emphasize interpersonal relationships and compassion towards others. For example, having a homeroom class every day to share what happened, what kind of problems classmates have. Noddings works are translated in Japanese and have a certain influence, particularly in the field of educational philosophy and moral education. The ethics of care are often discussed and adapted in the context, such as creating a safe learning community for all, having care in mind to make good relationships between students and teachers, argument about separation of public and private in school knowledge, such as connecting school knowledge to students' everyday life.
Now I'd like to talk about the case study. The target of our research is a teacher educator who has 10 years of teaching experiences at a national university in Japan. She started to teach gender studies course in the university because she realized that there was indifference about gender and sexuality issues among university staff members and students. In addition, she believes that all student teachers need to learn these issues to be prepared to teach diverse children. We collected data through interview and analysis of course curriculum and teaching materials. Our research questions are: what are the learning goals, contents, and teaching methods, and how does her beliefs reflect on them? And is care approach used in her teaching practice? If so, how? This chart shows goals and contents of the gender studies course. The main goals of the course are to examine stereotypical images of men and women and heterosexualism embedded in daily life, and to consider how the images influence social system and people's perceptions. The course covers several topics, including sexuality and gender-related issues, such as single parent and the poverty, gender image in media, long working hours and burden of housework, domestic and sexual violence. This shows that the course deals with sensitive issues that might enter student private life. Therefore, the teacher uses careful teaching approaches. Next slide, please. Yes. Now I'd like to look at 3 findings on the characteristics of the course. The first finding is that the teacher helps students to examine social systems critically to realize structural inequality. She considers that gender issues not as a personal matter, but as a matter of social systems. She believes that social systems shapes one's gender norms, and the dominant gender norms construct the system. Therefore, she lets students to examine social systems in the class. For example, she introduced same-sex marriage and civil partnership system in different countries and explained that there is no legal recognition for same-sex marriage in Japan. Then she discussed difficulties that same-sex couples would face when there is no legal protection, and then discussed dominant gender norms embedded in the system, such as gender binary and heterosexism. The second finding is that the teacher used stories or narratives to help students to learn others' perspectives. She always tells her students that those who can follow mainstream gender norms may find no problem with the norms. But there are some students in schools who might struggle because they don't fit to the mainstream gender norms. The teaching materials that the teacher used to share others' stories are comics, TV shows, and documentary videos. The materials contains personal stories such as the experiences of LGBT students and their struggles, pain, and needs. This comic shows the struggles of LGBT students. Through the comic book, the student teachers were given opportunities to imagine feelings and emotions of the character by putting themselves in the character's shoes. The teacher also used documentary videos made by University Students Ally Group. The group provides various teachers' toolkit. The toolkit contains videos of stories from sexual minority university students. In the video, they reflect on their school experiences and make some suggestions on how school teachers can help students like them. So this may help student teachers to feel responsible and motivate to take action. The third finding is that the teacher uses thoughtful and sensitive approach to create safe learning environments for all. She considers learning different vulnerability. For sexual minority students, she was careful not to force them to come out of the closet during the lesson. And for those who hold mainstream norms strongly, she was also careful not to make them feel being denied, because gender and sexuality norms, such as gender roles in the family, can be in a core of students' identity. So in order to provide safe environments for all, she used fiction stories as teaching materials, and she also encouraged students to reflect on their values through writing worksheets instead of discussion to avoid forcing students to reveal their identities.
Drawing from the case study, we present three main characters of ethics of care approach in human rights education. First, it focuses on learning from narrative of others, not generalized gay or Black people, and promotes intersectionality understanding of individual needs and structural inequality. Such personal focus also may motivate learners as advocates of social justice. Second, it is responsive to different dimensions of vulnerability and provides more sensitive approach to learners' different backgrounds, such as sexual minority students in the class. It also responsive to majority's feelings of guilt and possible struggles when their values are challenged, and by considering this, it motivates them to learn. Lastly, it helps to build a caring learning community, which provides a safe learning environment for all. It provides also a sensitive approach to asymmetrical power relationships in the classroom, such as between students and teachers, minorities in a closet. Thank you very much for your interest and attention.
That we move from that very detailed and interesting case study now to Hugh's presentation, but I can actually see mine appearing on the screen. Hugh, would you like me to go next, or would you?
It's all right, stand by. No, stand by. Let me just, that's easy enough. You were meant to go first, Audrey, but let me just quickly do this. And you can go, Hugh.
Okay. Sorry, I can we make this full screen?
Make it full screen.
Okay, right.
There we go. All right.
So my talk is about reimagining human rights education in the face of global challenges to democracy and human rights. And part of this, as you can see, is thinking that human rights education, an activist approach to society and to the world society. In this rather brief talk, I'm going to be talking about a normative approach to human rights education, some challenges from the 20th century experience of human rights education, and an example of political and religious opposition to this. I'm going to briefly mention the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training, and talk about pedagogical principles. And I end with considering children's rights education. Children's rights education has been the topic of my most recent research and writing and scholarship, with this book, Children's Rights Education in Diverse Classrooms, Pedagogy, Principles and Practice, that I co-authored with Lee Jerome, and that was published a couple of months ago. So if we talk about a normative approach to human rights, what we have is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, which, as Marta reminded us from, and Rebecca, from 1948, codifies human rights. And these are universal standards, what Donnelly calls functional universality. That is to say, anybody can use them. So the universal standards that can be picked up by anybody who wants to assert their right to something. But what they are not is a standardization. So we're not talking about a standardization of human rights, that human rights appear in exactly the same constellations. The institutions around human rights are not the same in all contexts. There are many contexts in which people individually challenge their oppression by reference to universal standards. So human rights discourse supports struggles. And as Rebecca has also mentioned, within asymmetrical power relations. And so this links to these struggles include the right to education that Marta introduced us to. That would include, for instance, Katerina Tomaszewski's concepts of education as being available, accessible, adaptable, and acceptable, which we haven't got time to go into today, but which are very important concepts within the right to education. There's the decolonizing and cosmopolitan perspective struggle, cosmopolitan, that is to say, rather than the national framing of education. And again, Rebecca has referred to that, and Audrey, I know, is going to come on to that in the next presentation. There's the issue of gender equality, again, that both Rebecca and Yuka and Yoriko have mentioned, and children's welfare and participation, that I will briefly refer to at the end, and it fits in also with an ethics of care. So in the 21st century, human rights themselves have been under threat. One example of this is that global standards and institutions are themselves under threat. And we have across the world a number of authoritarian and populist leaders, including in very powerful countries, for whom the national perspective is much more important than the global perspective or the United Nations perspective. And so they prioritize and what they perceive as a national interest against this collaborative apparatus that has been built up by the United Nations and other in international organizations. Another challenge that I will illustrate in a minute is that there are alliances often with these authoritarian populist leaders, of forms of politicized religion, and often conspiracy theories. And these are capable of mobilizing people, as we saw, I think, in the United States at the end of last year, by prioritizing. They prioritize some rights over other rights. And they then mobilize people through a religious or a mystical sort of discourse. Within the 21st century, the climate emergency is increasingly prevalent in our lives. It affects everyone, and in many cases extremely dramatically. It affects the poor even more than the rich. And a further challenge to human rights is that as a result of migration, a number of people, masses of people, get made stateless, so not receiving the protection that states and their legal systems provide. This is the concept of creating people who are not fully human, as Hannah Arendt and Leslie Kingston would put it. So all these challenges to human rights can be framed as human rights issues and explored through human rights education. So I'm saying that this is a new agenda for human rights education in the 21st century. And as an example of this religious and political opposition to human rights, I take the article by Alicia Munoz Ramirez in the first issue of Human Rights Education Review. And she pointed out that education for citizenship and human rights was introduced in 2006 in Spain. But neoconservative Catholics claimed that it was an indoctrination, it was an attack on traditional family life, it was against gender equality and against LGBT equality. That is to say that traditional family life is not sympathetic. Perspective on traditional family life is not sympathetic to gender equality or LGBT equality. As a result of this political campaign with a religious underpinning, parents withdrew their children. They claimed conscientious objection that they had a right to education in accordance with their conscience, which is indeed a human right. And as a consequence, the government withdrew the reform in 2013. And a very similar campaign happened in France in 2013 to 14. So one of the threats to human rights education, which would be pro-gender equality, pro-LGBT equality, is the mobilization of such opposition to human rights education. A useful way of framing human rights education is the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training from 2011, which talks about education about, for, and through human rights. So, education about human rights. Well, let's take as a starting point Jack Donnelly's assertion that human rights represent the most effective response yet devised to a wide range of standard threats to human dignity that market economies and bureaucratic states have made nearly universal. So if we think that human rights are an effective response to threats to human dignity, then obviously people need to know about human rights. A right isn't a right unless you know about it. So one role for scholars and educators is indeed to transmit knowledge about human rights instruments. And this is effectively normative knowledge, that there are certain universal norms. So knowledge about human rights instruments and the principles of underpinning human rights, which are universality, indivisibility, and interdependence of all human rights. Education for human rights is about, in the words of the Declaration, empowering persons to enjoy and exercise their rights and to respect and uphold the rights of others. And this means giving space for articulating and exploring the narratives and counter-narratives of individuals and groups, as Yuka and Yoriko have just been talking about. And this implies intersectionality. For, as Audrey Lorde said in her speech at Harvard in 1982, when she was celebrating the life of Malcolm X, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle. We do not lead single issue lives. The third element of this triptych of human rights education is education through human rights. And this is an education that builds on previous work, as Marta was reminding us of, pioneers such as Maria Montessori on child welfare, John Dewey, who developed theories of education for and of democracy and cosmopolitanism, the French educator Célestin Freinet, who developed cooperation as an educational approach, and the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, transformative education. So the education through human rights builds on this pioneering work, these pedagogical principles that have been developed across the 20th and now 21st century. And we arrive at attempts to enable learning and teaching in a way that respects the rights of both educators and learners. So this education focuses on pedagogical principles. So this is the theoretical part that aim to develop a theory of education through human rights. So human rights is a lens through which we view education. And participation is the key. Democracy is about participation. Cooperation is about participation. Children's rights are about participation. So one focus of this work in reimagining human rights education is a focus on children's rights education. And this starts from the assertion that children are not just citizens of the future, citizens in the making, but children are themselves citizens. And as citizens, they have the right to participate in procedures whereby order is constructed, maintained, and changed. This is what Basil Bernstein was talking about in 2000. And order is constructed, maintained, and changed in schools by things such as rules, discipline, timetables, exams and tests, homework, rewards and punishments, and the curriculum. So participation of children includes the right to challenge and attempt to change any of these procedures. And you do this in using the discourse of having a right to education and a right to all human rights. And in this, in children's rights education, the role of teachers is crucially important, because teachers are the duty bearers in international law. They have a responsibility to help children gain their rights. And so education about human rights and children's rights is hugely important in teacher education. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Everybody's keeping to time, and I hope I can do this the same. My talk is the future of human rights education research, and I would like to make some reflections, some broad general reflections on future direction. Next slide, please. Right, so human education has come out of a period of, since, as we've heard, the Universal Declaration in 1988, and has developed as a field of practice long before it developed as a field of research. The UN, go back please, the UN General Secretary Kofi Annan made this very clear when he talked about human rights as about the common language of humanity. Of course, that raises lots of questions about who we consider as human that we've already discussed. But the human rights ideal, a cosmopolitan endeavor, it was one which recognized that our neighbors or those to whom we are responsible, those to whom might, for example, exhibit an ethics of care, or those to whom we might defend their rights legally, not just those in our own neighborhood or our own nation, but it's an international project. It's one where we're responsible for the whole community, the global community. And this includes immediate neighborhoods. And I think that is something across the world, and perhaps not that I work in Norway and Nordic countries, we've been in recognizing the diversity that exists among us, both in the past and Rebecca has referred to the treatment of the Sami people, but also in the present. The first phase of human rights was to move beyond human rights as just belonging to law schools and about legal education, address school education, informal education, and professional training. Hugh's mentioned the professional education of teachers. There's a strong element of advocacy and awareness raising, and I think this raises big questions, which Hugh has touched on the role of advocacy in research and the relationship between advocacy and research. Next slide, please. Thanks. So I want to say a little bit about about human rights education research, because as we've heard, human rights and human rights education have been developing in a variety of forms, and some of these can be described as transformative, and Manisha Bajaj is amongst those who's written about transformative human rights education. Is it about maintaining the status quo, or is it actually about change? And if it's about change, what is the role of advocacy then in that? It's about, I would argue, examining the past and the present, but also possible futures. And we began our session today looking at the antecedents of human rights education. We've looked at developments in history and how we might reflect and how we understand the history of the mid-20th century, and Rebecca went into that. So, but it's also, I think, about imagining possible futures, and I think this is really, really key in child rights education and in alerting young people to the notion of participation, both in the present, but giving them understanding those big issues Hugh has talked about the climate emergency that they are likely to care passionate about and have perhaps a bigger interest in than their elders. In 2019, we established the WERA International Research Network on education, recognizing that although there's been lots and lots of work done on human rights education through organizations, there's actually, I would argue, that human rights education still holds a relatively fragile position within our universities beyond law schools, and especially in the education of teachers. I look across the globe, and whichever country I look at, I find there's a great gap between promoted and actually what goes in teacher education, and clearly that has a huge impact on school education. The network has attracted participants in its seminar series and through its core group in North America, from across Europe, African and Asian nations. Unfortunately, our seminar series has been geared up rather badly towards East Asia, but we are addressing that, as I will come to. But we also recognize that across the globe, not only are there different voices that are able to express themselves in terms of what human rights education is, and there's asymmetrical power relationships there and whose voices are heard, but there's also very unequal access to education research infrastructures, and that open access journals go a little way to addressing that, but they only go so far. And I think we need to reflect very much, as colleagues have already talked about, on the processes of knowledge production and power in which and in terms of the universities that we come from, and all the people speaking here are from well-funded universities. We may not always argue that to those who are the administrators in those universities, but relatively speaking, globally. Next slide, please. And then we've had reason, I think, as we're living through a global pandemic, to think about COVID-19 and what the politics of hope might look like, and what kind of changes and hopes that we might have for a future, including the shape of education, but particularly the shape of human rights education, and to reflect on the aims and approaches in human rights education and in human rights education research. Because the pandemic itself has clearly highlighted old inequalities. We've seen different abilities to respond to the pandemic, not just according to the care or carelessness of certain global leaders, but also according to health infrastructures and within countries. We've seen huge disparities of death rates. Britain is one clear example where by ethnicity there has been a much more serious impact of this pandemic on people of colour than of white citizens, and the same is true in the United States. And both those countries are countries where there are huge global inequalities, huge national inequalities between people of colour and white citizens. And of course, the Black Lives Matter struggle has not just, which began in the United States, has become global, and it's awakened a wider public, I think, and a wider range of researchers to past and present injustices. So I think there is opportunity here for human rights education, and there's a wider call for racial justice across nations. So despite hurt, anger, an awareness of past struggles, there's been a sense of hope within the Black Lives Matter movements. And part of this ongoing and urgent work for change is education itself. I'm not claiming that education is a solution, but it's part of the solution. And it's about a principle that recognizes our responsibilities across difference at local, national, and global scales. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a cosmopolitan approach, that we actually reach out across difference. And I think it may also incorporate an ethics of care into human rights education at a much stronger focus. Next slide, please. So one of the things is to deal with the denationalizing of school curricula. Rebecca made reference to national curriculum and talked about how this can actually hinder human rights education. But I think there are ways of denationalizing school curricula too, and to give a greater place to learners to find their own places and their own identities within a more inclusive, collective history. And part of decolonizing the curriculum, and it's only a part, is reconceptualizing the nation and enabling a new inclusive vision of who we are. Because, as Kamisha and Bayan say, when children enter classrooms, they do so in specific global locations and with specific positionings in history that privilege or repress their voices. For Judith Butler, a post-modern ethics permits us to address these power struggles and talks about addressing processes of dehumanization and lack of recognition. And this is the question of who is human, raised by Hannah Arendt and a number of others since. So these are clear questions for the curriculum, I think, and I think that power differentials are very much missing within the formal legal human rights framework. It doesn't address power differentials, and therefore human rights education will be all the poorer if it just follows that. Next slide, please. So I want to talk briefly about human rights education and an ethics of recognition to conclude. I think that the importance of an ethics of recognition and narrative in strengthening human rights education cannot be underestimated. Narrative approaches do carry real risks when vulnerable individuals are challenging entrenched power balances, and that's why the question of allies, which Yoriko referred to in the case study they were looking at, is clear. We need to have solidarity between the most vulnerable and the stronger in any different context. But nevertheless, narratives are key, I would argue, because they draw on specific localities, different traditions and cultures. The challenges and ambiguity and the human rights ideals which are set out in these international standards and the realities of learners' lives are often only too clear. And if we don't address these disparities and find ways of bringing together, finding ways of resolving these or addressing them in the classroom, then I think that the project will fail. And that's not about raising disparities internationally and saying, oh, those poor people over there don't have human rights and we do, but it's actually about looking at learners' own lives in the classrooms that we're addressing, either as researchers or as teachers. And I think this is probably our greatest challenge in human rights education, to find ways of addressing these dissonances and contradictions. So turning finally to what is recognition. Talked about the right to narrate, and he says to protect the right to narrate is to protect a range of democratic imperatives. And I think that's also what Hugh was talking about, democratic imperatives. It assumes that there is an equitable access to those institutions, schools, universities, museums, libraries, that give you a sense of collective history. This is about a new collective history and the means to turn those materials into a narrative of your own. And that's the project, I would argue, and both within human rights education research and within in classrooms. And finally, next slide. Have we got one missing? Is there another slide? So to talk about recognition and Homibaba, it's one that humanizes rather than dehumanizes. So the education that follows from that must necessarily include opportunities to reflect on different identities and cultural attributes, create personal narratives and processes of self-learning and self-care. Learners need opportunity to investigate and challenge official narratives, to challenge one-sided accounts and exclusive or excluding narratives. They need opportunities to develop their own individual narratives and, importantly, create new collective narratives through which they can make sense of the world and better understand both emotional, legal, and other aspects of human rights. I would argue that this is a challenge facing human rights education and indeed many other forms of social justice education. Thank you very much. And I think we now move, and we can see all the presenters now on screen, and we now move into questions. And whether we have questions from our audience. I in front of me here.
We have a question from Anna Maria
Yes.
in the discussion forum. She says a struggle in the US is the rights of undocumented students regarding access and equity in higher education due to their immigration status. So that's about migration and statelessness, or not receiving. So I wonder if other members of the panel would like to comment on migration inequity in higher education.
Clearly, it's an issue in the United States, but it's not confined to that nation. There are many other kinds of barriers that migrant students face, including recognition of their previous qualifications in many European states.
I can just say that this was an issue discussed already in 1945 after the end of the Second World War, when they drafted the first documents on human rights. And that was how to ensure that human rights would not just become empty words, but a reality for all the people who were then stateless after the Second World War. We had a huge immigration crisis in Europe due to internal immigrants from different countries who had fled during the regime and the two world wars. So this is I think that the human rights set forth in the UN conventions and declarations are really tested when it comes to immigrants and asylum seeking people's rights, because that's where you challenge the idea that rights are only connected to nationality and citizenship status. So I think it's a really good question that you're raising. I had a question on knowledge blindness. Do you think that it's possible to make teaching about human rights more sensitive to the continuous neglect of non-Western actors without reinventing the present history teaching? One of my main arguments is that the presentation of history today is actually neglecting a more wide history, not only on human rights, but if you look into new research on, for example, then the history of human rights and UN documents, you will find that researchers are asking new questions, are looking into other actors that have been like neglected in earlier studies. And I think that it's really important for us to now actually start giving credit to people from newly independent states who were arguing for human rights as universal human rights already after the Second World War and in the 50s and 60s, without falling into the trap of just criticizing human rights as Western imperialism without actually acknowledging, especially the women from the global south who have argued against Western actors in the UN for human rights, because human rights is a way to question colonialism. It's a way to question patriarchy. It's a way to question capitalist exploitation of labor, etc. So the more diverse understanding we have of the history, I think the more inspiration people have in different parts of the world to feel addressed by human rights as their own project and not just something that is creation from the West, because that's actually a false misconception.
Hugh wanted to put to Yoriko and you.
Yes, I apologize to Yuka for spelling her name wrong in my question, but I wonder if Yuka and Yoriko, whether your quadrant diagram or framing helps in the case of trans and non-binary people who are currently struggling for their right in the name of human rights. But it is an issue where it seems to me that a number of different rights are clashing, and maybe your quadrant could help with that. Would you like to comment on that?
Can you hear me? I'm not sure I can have the right answer, but currently not only the trans or binary, but also the most sexual minorities don't have the legal rights as same as mainstream the people. And actually in May, the ruling party LDP was about to set the kind of the Anti-Discrimination Act, but they declined it because they couldn't make a consensus. So, but this is kind of the failure of the legal approach. But if we mentioned about our diagram about the ethics of care, maybe we can focus on also individual aspects of the experiences of the sexual minorities and what kind of needs they need, and also the how can I say, the not dichotomy, the more like variations of identities. That's something we could introduce as a kind of perspective in the human rights education, I believe.
Marta, can you hear me?
Yes, I can now.
Guys, there's only 30 seconds, so there won't be a chance to answer any questions. There's only 30 seconds left, so I think let's say goodbye.
Okay, well, I thank everybody for listening and for all of you for participating. It's been a mixed discussion. We've covered a lot of issues here, and I very much follow these issues through in our international research network, and I hope that you'll all be encouraged to submit articles on these and publish these papers. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.